All right, I've recently done a couple of videos on Cold Steel sub-hilt knives, starting with the OSS, which I've had for the longest, and I was never terribly thrilled with it until recently. Part of the reason for that is, well, hollow ground blades, if it works well on that particular knife, I'm fine with it, but if it doesn't, yeah. And this one really didn't, because the secondary edge grind was really kind of obtuse. So it didn't have a very good edge, and especially on the back. The back was pretty much a butter knife. But in that video, I did some quick modifications, probably overdue modifications. One of the things I did was I reprofiled the edge to a much more acute appleseed on both sides, and now, yeah, it cuts great. And I like it a lot more. Also because I made some other minor modifications to the scabbard, which we'll look at in a second. But yeah, I took off a couple of the edges on this craton, well, rubber grip that were bothering me, just made it feel more comfortable in the hand. And then based on some conversations we had in the comments about sub-hilt knives and some of your recommendations, I did recently pull the trigger on a knife that's been on my wish list for a long time, and suddenly got a screaming deal on it, and that was, well, the much higher end version of the design from Cold Steel, the Black Bear Classic. So I refer to my initial impressions video on that knife. But at the end of that video, I said I was going to invest some serious time into, well, hopefully a pretty detailed exploration on the use of the sub-hilt knife. Does it work? Is it an advantage? And if so, how so? So getting that conversation going and starting to train with it. And as part of that, I decided, yeah, to spend a little bit more money on a knife that I thought about getting, but since I wasn't terribly thrilled with its brother, the OSS, I haven't in 10 years until it just showed up on my door today. And that would be the OSI, the single-edged version of the OSS. So let me give you my just post-unboxing initial impressions. Alright, right out of the box, right out of the packaging, first impressions and a few stats. Well, it came well packed together in the sheath, just covered in a plastic bag inside the box, and yes, it has the exact same SecureX sheath as the other two knives. Now, I did mention I had a couple of issues with this sheath, but it has a lot of potential. First problem I have with this sheath is a rigid sheath with a lot of retention connected to a long floppy belt strap just really doesn't work for me. Every time you try to draw it, you wind up, yeah, and it hangs sloppy, and I just don't like it. The other thing I didn't like about it, especially with this sub-hilt design, is you'll notice that this sort of weather cover, or whatever you want to call it here, that covers part of the hilt. Also, it covers a lot of this space in here where your finger would normally reach to get ahead of that sub-hilt. Can't really get my finger in there to help me draw the knife. So a couple of things I did immediately to the other knives' sheaths were, I'll put a little bit of a relief cut in here so I can get to the sub-hilt a lot easier, right? I also, one of the things you can do with these is you can put a little bit of filing, just carefully, just a shave at a time, to the four little studs that are in there that grip onto the guard, to get that release and retention exactly where you want it. Now be careful, because you can't go backwards, but you can do some tuning. The other thing about this sheath, it is set up for a lot of different options. So one of the things I did to give it a secure belt mounting is I took a heavy piece of leather and some Chicago screws, and I basically gave it a solid belt loop. And we'll take a look at how that wears in a second. So I'm probably going to immediately do those three things, to this sheath. But pop it out, take a look at the blade. Initial impressions, I wish I would have gotten this one before the OSS, or maybe went ahead and gotten it immediately after the OSS, because I think I would have liked it more, and I do actually like it more than the OSS in certain ways. Now, the reason why they made a single-edged version is because you might be in a jurisdiction that prohibits the carry of a double-edged dagger. But there's certain things about a single-edged knife that we'll look at as we do future reviews on the topic of the sub-hilt that might make this a better utility knife overall. Having that back edge, being able to baton, might be better in the chop, being able to get your thumb on top of it for, closer work, or even choke up a little bit on it for closer work. But one of the major differences, just in initial specs, it's about an ounce heavier than the OSS, probably because of the blade profile. So instead of 9 ounces, 10 ounces. Okay. Also, it is a full flat grind, and it does have a secondary bevel on it. Now, I haven't done any cutting, so this is first time right out of the box. How does it cut? Yeah. Oh yeah. Quite nicely. So, Cold Steel did a good job, which is usual for them. I feel like the OSS I got was kind of an outliner in not having a good edge. But yeah, I just, initial impressions, I like the look, the feel, the handling, and potentially the function of this version better. Now, some other interesting things about it, taking some measurements. 1/4 of an inch longer. I mentioned that on the Black Bear too. 8¼ inch blade versus an 8-inch blade on at least my generation 10-year-old OSS. Also has a much smaller ricasso than the other two knives, so it gives me more cutting surface. Not so much of a space I can put my finger up over the top, but yeah, if you want a little bit more cutting surface, and it does have that little notch at the end of the edge for, sharpening and such, to make sure you can get to the full end of the edge without running into the ricasso with whatever you're sharpening with. But yeah, 3/16 of an inch thick, which is the same thickness as the OSS, but most of that is kind of relieved with that double edge profile. This one being, one single edge plane all the way up to the spine. Yeah, I can see where this one in testing and application is going to be a better knife. But let's take a look really quickly at that carry option. All right, so as I mentioned in the conclusion of my initial impressions review on the Black Bear, I do plan to do a really thorough dive into function and use of sub-hilt knives. Now I've got a couple to work with, and who knows, I might pick up a couple of more. They're not a lot on the production market, so if you have any recommendations, definitely throw those in the comments. Yeah, a lot of them have been discontinued, and the custom ones are thousands and thousands of dollars, and I'm certainly not ready to spend that kind of money at this point in my life. But yeah, I want to definitely give the sub-hilt a really good exploration. And I think this is going to make an interesting addition, because having a knife that's got just a little bit more mass in the blade than the OSS, not as hefty as the Black Bear, and also the things you can do with a single-edged knife versus a double-edged knife and vice versa. Yeah, that's certainly going to play into it. I'm also probably going to take this knife out and do more field utility, outdoorsy kind of stuff. I will try more chopping, and I'll even try batoning and stuff like that, just because of the way it's shaped. Now, this is an Osate A blade, just like the OSS, and they have certainly shown that they can hold up, and they've certainly shown that they are effective in, well, more emergency situations. One of the things I mentioned in the video of the OSS is there's a pretty famous video on YouTube. You can look it up. And one of my viewers corrected me. I finally found it again and viewed it again. It happened in South Africa, and it was a water buffalo. They were on a kind of a tourist safari. Things got out of control. Water buffalo wound up on top of the dad, and the son came in with his OSS from the side. 3 deep penetrating thrusts to the flank. Well, let's say that was the end of the threat. Don't want to get into the gory details. You can watch the video if you want to. But the knife has certainly proven itself in a lot of different field uses, emergency uses, and its potential for self-defense. Let's talk a little bit about carry. One of the reasons why I chose that firm belt loop is I don't like knives that flop around on my waist, and I've been experimenting with these blades. They are a bit longer than what I'm used to handling, carrying, training with an 8-inch blade versus a 7.5 or a 6-inch blade. That also affects wear for me. Having something down lower on my belt rigid, well, then I can't sit down. Having it down lower, I really need to have it strapped to my thigh, especially with something like the SecureX Sheath, to get that counter tension to pull against. Now, if I had a different kind of sheath, and I may order one, I've got my eye on a couple, that would allow me to have some different kinds of carry options. We'll get into that in the future, but here's just a quick preview of what I've been working on so far. This retention system allows me to mount a belt loop on either side. Now, I did just get some longer Chicago screws, which would allow me to basically put one on either side simultaneously, so I can reverse carry position without needing a screwdriver. But until then, I've kind of chosen, as my training option for now, carrying it edge forward on the right hip. And it's pretty high on the hip. Being high on the hip like this allows me to sit down and, well, not wind up with the knife in my way, so that's a good thing. It also winds up being pretty snug to my body, so that's also a good thing in my head. Drawing it. Well, if I need to draw it in a hurry, I'm thinking that the other guy is going to be pretty much on top of me. This allows me to reach down and draw it in the reverse grip very, very quickly. Not a problem. And that sub-hilt really helps get that positive grip and draw. If I want to reach it in a forward grip, I can kind of do, well, we'll call it the Wild Bill Hickok, who used to wear his revolvers backwards. You flip the hand around, draw it out this way. Since I'm used to actually practicing drawing a, well, trigger warning, handgun that way, just as a novelty, I'm kind of used to doing that, so it's not so bad. Now, I do have to flip it over if I want to resheath it, but that's not a hard thing. I can easily reach it, of course, from the left hand and draw it that way. I've also been practicing some options drawing it on the other side. If I've got it edge backwards in the more traditional draw, I tend to have to reach over like this and draw up on a knife that's really long. So that one isn't working for me on this side. I'd have to wear the knife lower. So, to be continued. Anyway, let's get our usual conversation going in the comments. Any questions you have about any of these three knives? And how I'm making progress on how they're used. Are they useful? Any of those topics. Do you have any experiences or preferences regarding knives like this? Any favorites you want to recommend to me? Anything you find when you're surfing online you want to send my way in terms of a link or something like that? I would definitely appreciate it. But otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching, following, subscribing, and I hope to see you back for more.